The summer of 1974 started like any other summer in Washington state. Families gathered at Lake Sammamish, children played in the water, and the sun beat down on the crowded beaches. I was a detective with the King County Police, working homicides and missing persons. I thought I had seen everything the job could throw at me. I was wrong. On July 14th, two young women vanished from that beach in broad daylight. Janice Ott was 23 years old, a probation caseworker with her whole life ahead of her. Denise Naslund was 18. Both disappeared within hours of each other, surrounded by thousands of witnesses. At first, we thought maybe they had wandered off, maybe gone swimming and gotten into trouble. But as the hours turned into days, we knew something far worse had happened. Witnesses started coming forward with a strange story. They described a handsome young man with his arm in a sling, asking women for help, loading a sailboat onto his car. He was polite, well-spoken, charming even. He introduced himself as Ted. Several women had refused his request and walked away. Janice Ott had agreed to help. She was last seen walking toward the parking lot with this man. That was the last time anyone saw her alive. The name Ted echoed through our investigation like a ghost. We canvassed the area, interviewed hundreds of people, compiled witness statements. The descriptions were remarkably consistent. Good-looking man, dark hair, athletic build, around 5'10", drove a tan or light brown Volkswagen Beetle, had a sailboat, or at least claimed to have one, and that arm in a sling, the perfect prop to appear harmless and in need of assistance. We knew we were dealing with something unusual. Abductions in daylight from a crowded public place required confidence, planning, and a complete lack of fear. This wasn't someone acting on impulse. This was someone who had done this before, someone who knew exactly what he was doing. As summer turned to fall, more women disappeared across Washington state. University students mostly, young and attractive, with long dark hair parted in the middle. The pattern was becoming clear, but we still had no solid leads. We were drowning in tips and potential suspects. Every man named Ted in the Seattle area became a person of interest. Every Volkswagen owner got a second look. But we had nothing concrete, nothing that would hold up in court. That fall, we did something revolutionary for the time. We partnered with the University Computer Science Department and created a database, a massive machine that took up an entire room in the basement of the King County Police building. We fed it everything we had: vehicle registrations for Volkswagen Beetles, lists of men named Ted or Theodore, known sex offenders, friends and acquaintances of the victims. The computer cross-referenced these lists, looking for matches across multiple categories. The machine spat out 26 names that appeared on at least 4 different lists. Near the top of that list was a name that would haunt me for the next 15 years. Theodore Robert Bundy. Ted Bundy. He was a law student, a former psychology major, a volunteer at a suicide prevention hotline. He had no criminal record. He was engaged to be married. On paper, he looked like the last person who would hurt anyone. We added him to our suspect list, but he was one name among thousands. We didn't have enough to bring him in, didn't have enough to even justify serious surveillance. So we watched and waited and hoped we would catch a break before someone else disappeared. Then, in November of 1974, a woman named Carol DeRonch survived an attempted abduction in Utah. She described a man who claimed to be a police officer, who tried to handcuff her and force her into his Volkswagen. She fought back, escaped, and gave police a description that matched our Ted perfectly. A few hours after that attempted abduction, a young woman named Deborah Kent disappeared from a high school parking lot in Utah. We weren't the only ones hunting this ghost anymore. In August of 1975, a highway patrolman in Utah pulled over a Volkswagen Beetle that was driving erratically in a residential neighborhood at 2 in the morning. The driver was Theodore Bundy. In the car, the officer found handcuffs, a crowbar, an ice pick, and rope. Bundy was arrested. When I heard the news, I felt a mixture of relief and rage. We had been so close. He had been right there on our list. and he had slipped away to continue killing in another state. I flew to Salt Lake City immediately. I wanted to interview him, wanted to look him in the eye and see what we were dealing with. But Ted Bundy wasn't interested in talking to me. He sat across from me in that interrogation room, and he smiled. It wasn't a nervous smile or an angry smile. It was almost amused, like he was enjoying some private joke. He answered my questions with questions of his own. He denied everything, claimed the items in his car were innocent, said he had never been to Washington State despite evidence to the contrary. His lawyer shut down the interview after 20 minutes. I flew back to Seattle, knowing we had the right man, but lacking the evidence to prove it. Bundy was charged with aggravated kidnapping in the Duranch case. He was convicted and sentenced to 15 years in prison. We thought that was the end of it. We thought he was locked away and we could finally close our cases. We were wrong again. In 1977, Bundy was extradited to Colorado to face murder charges in the death of Corinne Campbell. He was being held in the Garfield County Jail, awaiting trial. Then, on December 30th, he escaped. He simply walked out of the courthouse during a recess, jumped from a second-story window, and disappeared into the Colorado mountains. He was recaptured 8 days later, but the damage was done. He had proven he could slip away whenever he wanted. 6 months later, he escaped again. This time, he crawled through a hole in the ceiling of his cell, made his way through the ductwork, and dropped down into the apartment of the jailer who lived above the jail. He stole clothes, walked out the front door, and vanished. For weeks, we had no idea where he was. Then bodies started appearing in Florida. Young women brutally murdered in their sorority house and apartments. The violence was escalating. He wasn't just killing anymore. He was destroying his victims with a rage that seemed to grow with each attack. Bundy was finally captured in Florida in February of 1978 after a traffic stop. This time, there would be no escape. He was charged with multiple murders, and the evidence against him was overwhelming. Bite marks on one of the victims matched his teeth perfectly. Eyewitnesses placed him at the scenes. His credit card records tracked his movements across the country. He was convicted and sentenced to death. For the next 6 years, Bundy sat on death row at Florida State Prison while his appeals wound through the courts. During that time, Seattle was being terrorized by another serial killer, one who was dumping bodies along the Green River. The press started calling him the Green River Killer. We had no leads, no suspects, and the body count kept rising. I had moved on to work with the Washington State Attorney General's office, helping develop new techniques for catching serial. In October of 1984, I received a letter. The return address was Florida State Prison. The letter was from Ted Bundy. He had been following the Green River case in the newspapers, and he wanted to help. He wrote that he understood how serial killers thought, how they operated, and he could provide insights that would help us catch this new killer. He didn't explicitly admit to being a serial killer himself, but the implication was clear. He signed the letter. "Do not ask me why I consider myself an expert in this field, just accept that I am." I showed the letter to my partner, Dave Reichert, and we made the decision to go to Florida. We needed all the help we could get, and if Bundy really did have insights that could save lives, we had to at least listen. We flew down in November with a portable video camera, something relatively new for police work at the time. We wanted to record everything he said. The Florida State Prison death row was exactly what you would expect. Concrete walls, fluorescent lights, the smell of disinfectant trying to cover up decades of despair. They brought Bundy into an interview room with bulletproof glass separating us. The man who walked in wasn't the confident law student from our case files. He looked thinner, older, worn down by years of appeals and the knowledge that he was running out of time. But his eyes were the same. Sharp, calculating, always watching. He wanted to talk about the Green River Killer, not about himself. He spoke in third person, always referring to the killer as if he were discussing someone else entirely. He explained how a serial killer would choose his victims, how he would approach them, what he would do with the bodies. He suggested we set up surveillance at the dump sites because the killer would return to them. He talked about the importance of the initial contact, what he called the front part, the moment when the killer first interacted with his victim. That was where mistakes were made, he said. That was where we would catch him. I listened to all of this and took notes, but I kept circling back to the real questions. I asked him directly if he was describing his own methods, his own experiences. He would smile, that same smile I remembered from Utah, and deflect. He would say he was talking about the Riverman, his nickname for the Green River Killer, not about himself. But sometimes he would slip. He would say, I, instead of he. He would talk about the rush of the hunt, the planning, the fantasy that preceded the act. And in those moments, the mask would crack just a little, and I could see the truth underneath. Over the next few years, I returned to Florida several times. Each visit, Bundy revealed a little more. He was trading information for time, hoping that if he proved himself useful, the state might grant him a stay of execution. But Florida Governor Bob Martinez was unmoved. He made it clear that the state would not allow a serial killer to manipulate the justice system. The execution would proceed as scheduled. As Bundy's execution date approached in January of 1989, he finally started talking about his own crimes. He confessed to murders in Washington, Utah, Colorado, Idaho, and Florida. He drew maps showing where he had dumped bodies. He provided details that only the killer could know. But even then, he couldn't fully admit what he had done. He talked about himself in third person, described his actions as if he were describing scenes from a movie. He seemed genuinely disconnected from the horror of what he had done. 3 days before his execution, Bundy called me. He wanted to talk about Georgianne Hawkins, a University of Washington student who had disappeared in June of 1974. She had left her sorority house late at night to walk to her boyfriend's dorm. A distance of less than 100 yards, she vanished somewhere on that short walk. We had searched everywhere for her, brought in cadaver dogs, dug up yards, dragged the lake. We never found a trace of her. Bundy told me what happened to Georgianne Hawkins. He told me in graphic detail that I will not repeat here. He laughed while he told the story, actually laughed, as if recounting a funny anecdote from college. There was no remorse, no humanity in his voice. He was proud of what he had done. Proud of how long he had evaded capture. He bragged about returning to the dump sites, about moving body parts, about driving past police roadblocks with evidence right there in his car. He told me about 11 victims in Washington state alone. Some we had suspected were his work, but couldn't prove. Others were women we didn't even know were missing. He described their last moments with the detachment of someone describing a shopping list. I had interviewed hundreds of criminals in my career, but I had never encountered anyone quite like Ted Bundy. He was intelligent, articulate, and completely devoid of empathy. One detail from those final interviews stayed with me. Bundy described how he would sometimes return to the scenes where he had left bodies. He would sit in his car, watching police search the area, sometimes getting out and joining the search parties as a volunteer. He found it amusing that law enforcement officers would look right at him, even thank him for his help, never suspecting that he was the one they were looking for. He said he felt invisible, like he was playing a game that only he understood the rules to. My friend Elizabeth Klopfer, who had dated Bundy in the early 70s, once told me a story that illustrated this perfectly. She said that when she and Bundy would leave her apartment, so many unmarked police cars would start their engines simultaneously that it sounded like the start of the Indianapolis 500. They were watching him even then. We were so close, always so close, but never quite close enough until it was far too late. On January 24, 1989, Theodore Robert Bundy was executed in the electric chair at Florida State Prison. Outside the prison, crowds gathered. Some held signs celebrating his death. Others protested capital punishment. The media circus was unlike anything I had ever seen. Bundy had become a symbol, though I'm not sure anyone could agree on what exactly he symbolized. Evil, perhaps, or the failure of society to recognize predators among us, or simply the dark fascination humans have with violence. In his final interviews, Bundy tried to blame his crimes on pornography and alcohol. He wanted people to believe that external factors had corrupted an otherwise good person. But I had looked into his eyes too many times to believe that. Whatever made Ted Bundy into what he became, it was inside him long before he saw his first pornographic magazine or drank his first beer. Some people are born with something missing, some fundamental piece of humanity that allows the rest of us to connect with each other, to feel empathy and remorse. Bundy didn't have that piece. Maybe he never did. The investigation into Ted Bundy changed how we approach serial murder cases. The database we created to track him became the model for what is now the Homicide Investigation Tracking System, or HITS. The interviews I conducted with him on death row helped create the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit. We learned to look for patterns, to share information across jurisdictions, to use technology to find connections that human minds might miss. And the Green River Killer, the case that brought Bundy and me back together after all those years. We finally caught him in 2001. His name was Gary Ridgway, and he confessed to 49 murders, though the true number is likely much higher. Many of the techniques we used to build the case against Ridgway came from insights Bundy provided. The killer did return to his dump sites, just as Bundy predicted. He did keep trophies from his victims. He did follow a pattern that, once we understood it, led us right to him. I've been asked many times over the years whether I think Bundy was telling the truth in those final interviews. Did he really kill 30 women like he claimed, or was it more? The honest answer is, I don't know. I believe much of what he told us was true, but I also believe he was still playing games, still manipulating, still enjoying the attention and the power that came from holding back information. There are families out there who still don't know what happened to their daughters, their sisters, their friends. Bundy took those secrets with him. I retired from law enforcement years ago, but the case of Ted Bundy never really left me. I dream about it sometimes. I'm back at Lake Sammamish on that hot summer day in '74. I can see him moving through the crowd, charming and handsome, looking for his next victim. And I'm running, trying to reach her before he does, but I'm always too slow. I always arrive just moments too late. That's what it was like investigating Ted Bundy. We were always one step behind, always just missing him, always arriving to find that he had already moved on. Even when we had his name on our list, even when every piece of evidence pointed directly at him, he slipped away. It took 5 years, dozens of victims across multiple states, and 2 prison escapes before he was finally stopped for good. I think about the victims often, not just the ones we know about, but the ones we don't. The Jane Does who were never identified, the missing persons cases that were never connected to Bundy, the women who got away but never reported what happened because they thought no one would believe them. For every Janice Ott and Denise Nasland whose names we know, there might be others whose names we will never learn. Ted Bundy died on January 24th, 1989, but the shadow he cast is still with us. He proved that the monster doesn't always look like a monster. Sometimes he looks like the charming man at the beach with his arm in a sling. Sometimes he looks like your classmate, or your neighbor, or the volunteer at the crisis center. And that might be the most terrifying thing of all.